It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. His name is Dr Simon Longstaff. Simon's an Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, being selected as the inaugural leader of the Centre in 1991 with a PhD in philosophy from Cambridge. Simon's been named one of the AFR's Boss magazine's true leaders of the 21st century. His book, Hard Cases, Tough Choices, was published in 1997. He's one of Australia's greatest public intellectuals with a sound grounding in everyday life. He also happens to be director of Our Community. His keynote presentation is entitled The Courage to Make a Stand. Please make him feel welcome.
Thanks. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for that introduction. I told Paul, drop out the greatest. It's a bit over the top. And I'd like to thank Dennis and James for the invitation to be with you today. You can probably tell just by looking at me that I'm not really that much engaged in sport in a day-to-day basis. I was never particularly good at it. Even as a little boy, I used to turn up and things like that, but never started in it, although I have had an abiding interest in it. But for reasons that are perhaps a little bit different to some people. For me, I'll talk a bit about it. It's to do with the significance of sport for what it can tell us in a world which is so deeply scarred by cynicism. And that's where I want to start with this notion of moral courage in particular and how it fits and the remarks today. To understand why it might actually matter to expose yourself to the challenges of taking on a leadership role, and I don't mean by this having a position which has got a big title in it or any particularly significant function within a hierarchy. I'm talking more about the willingness to lead, which I'll unpack a little bit, which any of us can actually take on when the opportunity arises. Why would you do it? And particularly, why would you do it in relation to sport? Well, I think the first thing that we all know, so forgive me for stating the obvious, is that the times in which we're living today are ones where there's been a precipitous decline in trust in almost every single institution that you can think of. It's been quite a sad thing to watch. It's almost like a series of dominoes that have fallen, one after the other. We saw it in politics. I now live in New South Wales, and anybody who's lived there in the last 10 years or so would have seen a phenomenon in which the Independent Commission Against Corruption was laying out tale after tale after tale of really serious corruption in the political process. And it wasn't just that you had political parties who were pursuing their own naked self-interest, which I suppose they're going to do in any political contest. What they were doing was damaging public institutions like the Parliament, which don't actually belong to them at all. Parliaments and good government, they belong to us as citizens. And to have a group of people who were trashing those things for their own self-interest, it was a despicable thing. And you saw the public, as you still see today, recoiling from this. And sometimes when you see close election results, hung parliaments, people say, oh, well, that's because the community's fickle. We're not at all fickle, I don't think. I think we know exactly what we want. We just can't find it. And we haven't been able to find it in mainstream political parties for a while. So institutions there have fallen over. Think about the recent revelations involving the banking and finance industry, whether it's been in insurance or financial advice. It used to be the case when I was growing up, and it probably is still the case on official forms, that if ever you needed to have your signature verified or someone to attest to your good character, there would be a list of people who could do this. And that list would include people like lawyers and probably clergy and things of that kind, but it also included bank managers. Now, that was a very different time when one imagined that because you were a bank manager, you were a paragon of your society. I was saying to a group of bankers, I think it was yesterday, that if you were just to imagine that you wake up one morning and there's been a completely artificial, a completely false headline published in every newspaper in Australia. And the headline says, banks confiscate the savings from school children's accounts. What would we all wake up and think? Would we all say, oh no, that can't be true, that's not like them, they wouldn't possibly do that? Or would we be saying, there they go again. Here is the latest outrage. And unfortunately, for people in banking and finance, that's the latter point is the true point, that our community would probably believe that this was true, even though it was just a confection. Or you can think of the standards of the churches. I mean, the Catholic Church and others as well have for 2,000 years said that love is more important than the law, that people are more important than property, that you should stand up and face the truth about your place in the world. And yet when they were confronted by the terrible allegations involving clergy and the sexual abuse of children and other vulnerable people, what they did was, of course, was to put the law before love, property before people, to try and protect their backs rather than face the truth. Another domino topples. And you've probably got your own stories of institutions which have conducted themselves in ways which have broken trust, which have behaved with hypocrisy. And that is the great, if you like, generator of the acid of cynicism in any society. It's when you say that you stand for one thing and you do something else. And we learn about this from the time that we're small children. How can that possibly be true, that someone I was supposed to trust would say this and do that? And it's this acid that eats away at the bonds of our society. Now, in that world, where it's happened time after time after time, and we might come to some of the reasons for why that is, there is something that I think is peculiarly special about sport, or at least should be. And it's a very obvious thing. It's not to do with the theatre, the spectacle. It's not to do with the community of people that can come together around a common cause, united by symbols and things like that. All of those things are important. It is that at its very best, what sport can present us with is a picture of something true, something that is real, which is embodied, that at its best, a contest between people of equal, whether they're netballers or whether or not they're in the footy codes or any of the sports that might be represented at a gathering like this, there is something which we think is essentially true, because this contest is intended to be between actual people bringing their real skills, the real elements of their character to persist even when they may seem destined to defeat. All of those things are what we go to see at sport, which is why it is so devastating if you discover that someone has in fact been using performance-enhancing drugs, or if there's been a betting scandal where somebody has fixed the result in order to bring about a predetermined outcome. These things are not just bad because you might say people shouldn't cheat, people shouldn't lie. What it does is it destroys the very foundations of what makes sport such an important thing within the lives of a community, particularly in the times in which we live today. And we can see something of the sign of that importance in the fact that amidst all this cynicism which exists, and there are very few people who you can speak to who won't actually give you their story, in the midst of that, despite everything I've just said, every single Saturday morning, right across this land, you will find people out there on netball courts, football fields, all sorts of different arenas for contest, families with parents coaching and people standing on the sidelines and children participating, range of ages throughout the day, from young to old. There they are still doing it. Not simply as a spectacle which is served up where you get, like the great elite contests of the world, but as a vital component within the day-to-day life of every community in this country. There it is persisting. Persisting not just because it produces good health and vigour, not just because of that community association, because it's an embodiment of an experience where the truth actually lives. Now, if you think that that's important, as I do, then it means it raises a question as to whether any one of us is willing to be able to defend this thing, or better still, not merely defend it, to help it to be true, to take this ideal and make it real. And every one of us has a capacity to do that if we choose. And in every time we make the choice to do this, we choose to lead, if we choose. Now that's easy when I say it like that. You'd say, well, of course, why wouldn't we? Wouldn't this be an exciting thing to do? just think of the good that we might do just by that one thing. Whatever our role, whatever our capacity, if we just choose to lead. But the truth of it is that what I'm inviting you to do, and many of you do it already, but what I'm perhaps inviting you to continue to do, is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult. Because we live in a world where very few others want us to lead. If anything, our society is set in a way which would prefer less leadership than more. Because what leaders do is that they disturb the status quo. Imagine a sporting organisation, a council, a corporation, or anything. Imagine our society as a cork which sits in a stream. Now, this cork flows, but one of the most important things about it is we don't want it to tip over. None of us want to fall into the drink and be saturated. So there are a range of people whose job it is to keep the cork stable. They pull levers, they push buttons, they balance the thing, and we all go. But what they don't do is have any effect upon the direction in which the cork is moving. These people are managing the life of the cork. And management is vital. As I say, the stability that it provides to a system, its operational effectiveness is something important and needs to be done. But there is something which goes beyond management, and that is leadership. Because leaders are never willing to go simply where the stream happens to be taking them. They're not there just for the ride. What leaders always do is they impart a sense of direction to an organisation. They are always challenging the things which are going to cause the stream to drift too close to the rocks here or over a cliff there. In other words, leaders naturally undermine the simple certainties of life on the cork, if only it was left to go wherever the stream might take it. Now, the reason why this is so important is that when you look at any of the cases that I gave to you before, cases which disturb us, which pull into question institutional life, not only is it observable that this is being caused by hypocrisy, but there's a deeper level in which you can begin to understand what leads to that hypocrisy in the first place. And it's not, as some people suspect, it is not the case that bishops and prime ministers and bank executives and heads of boards and this, they don't wake up in the morning and say, look, my task today is to see how much hypocrisy I can engage in by lunchtime. I want to go to bed tonight with lots of people feeling much more cynical about the world, about my organisation. If I can get that, that's a good day's work. They just don't do that. What they do is they get up and they do things day in, day out without much thought. And when you ask them, why have you done this particular thing? The response is, well, what do you mean? Everybody does it like this. That's just the way things are done around here. And I'd ask you to reflect yourself about your own organisational context. If I was to come in, sit down with your colleagues, chat away and say, look, can you tell me about what you do? And then, they tell me and they say, look, can I ask you, why do you do it? How many times might someone say to me, oh, what do you mean? We do it because that's the way we do things around here. Or everybody does it in this industry or this club or this particular sporting code or this profession. Because if you hear that, that's the invitation for a particular kind of leadership to step up to ensure that the unthinking custom and practice, the simple habits that can get us into so much trouble, that they are challenged. And the role that challenges that is the role of the leader, whatever their position. So we've been arguing for some time that leadership is, in its essence, constructive subversion. What leaders do is that they subvert the unthinking custom and practice that exists around them. Leaders never accept that something is simply done because everybody does it this way. They never accept that it's simply done because it's always been done that way. What they always ask an organisation to do, they always engaging with other people is, can you tell us why we do this in a way that relates to the purpose of this organisation? Can you tell us how this matches up with our values and our principles? Can you tell us that the things we do is calibrated to what gives our organisation meaning? Because if we're doing things which aren't consistent with those things, if we're acting in ways because that's just the way it's always been, it might be a legacy system, because it's always been this for 15, 20, 100 years, 1,000 years, and it's not consistent with what we claim to be our purpose and our values and our principles, then that will be the seat, the legitimate seat of an observation of hypocrisy. Leaders ask these questions, though, not because they want to destroy the organisations within which they operate, and not because they want to impose upon it their own idiosyncratic, their own personal view of what the world should be. They do it for one purpose and one purpose alone. They do it in order to help the organisation to become more like the thing it says it wants to be. How could we be more like this? And that's where moral courage comes in as its first count. Because almost no one wants you to do this. When you ask these questions of people who have been going about their day-to-day activities quite happily for a long time, when it's part of the established wisdom about the way things are done, people don't say, oh, thanks for asking about that, that's a really interesting question, let's stop and have a look at this. The more common response is, shut up, go away. I know how to do my job. This is settled. We don't need you asking these difficult questions. And when you ask these questions in the context of your peers will say, shut up, go away. You're drawing attention to yourself. You're making the rest of us look bad. And when you ask these questions in the context of those to whom you report, unfortunately, they're going to say, shut up, go away. It's above your pay grade. Some of these questions will strike at the heart of accepted wisdom that defines an organisation's normal practices. Some of these questions that leaders ask will threaten the very substance of what everybody believes to be the normal and appropriate way to operate. Some of these questions will put you into the position of an apparent heretic, a troublemaker, a person who's out there. Now, I don't advocate that people throw themselves heedlessly onto the funeral pyre of integrity. I don't think the job is to say, look, I'm going to now throw caution to the wind, and every single opportunity I'm going to dive into the centre of the fire and up I'll go in a pile of ashes and smoke, a few brief, beautiful sparks and I'm gone. That's not what leadership's about either. The notion of courage, as originally developed, at least in the Western tradition by the Greeks, recognises that all of the virtues sit within what Aristotle called the golden mean, that it's a point between two extremes. Courage is one of the classic examples of how to understand a virtue. Courage does not belong to the individual who, heedless of the danger, races into the face of the cannon and is blown to smithereens to no good effect. That is just recklessness. Courage does not belong to the individual who recognises the danger and is overmastered by it and hides behind their friends and exposes their backs to danger while they remain safe. That is cowardice. Courage is when you recognise the danger and you stand there and respond appropriately with all of the relevant measures balancing other considerations, where you don't just destroy yourself, but you're there to achieve the particular. That is what courage is. And it means, therefore, that you will have to pick times when it's appropriate to move forward, pick times when you stand still, but you know, if you are a person of moral courage, that there will be a time when you have to take a stand, when you have to lead. Now, there are two further difficulties in this courage, business of being courageous. The first is that you're going to be asked to be courageous, at least in the ethical dimension, in conditions of radical uncertainty. I'd love to tell you that there is a religion or a philosophy or a science that guarantees you in each and every situation where you might lead that you will be in possession of clear understanding about what is right and good to do. I'd love to tell you that such things exist. They do not. And they cannot. And it's not to do with a fault of human reason or an absence of religious belief. I'll show you why there cannot be absolute certainty for creatures like us. That is, we human beings, we don't know if it's unique, but we do know of ourselves. We are not bound simply to act as a matter of instinct or desire. We can make conscious choices, but we do so in conditions of radical uncertainty. Most of life's questions which are easier, like good and bad, right and wrong, Well, we deal with them pretty well. The problem I'm adverting to is where it's good versus good, right versus right. Imagine that you are a person who believes in truth. Imagine you have an equal commitment to compassion. Both of these things are important to you. And your mum comes home one day with her new dress, says, "Honey, darling, what do I look like?" And you look at your mother and you think, "Oh, no, what a disaster." And you know, however, that if you tell your mum the truth, you're going to hurt her. Truth pulls you in this direction. Compassion pulls you in this direction. 10 units of truth want you to go this way. 10 units of compassion want you to go this way. Put them together, what have you got? A null position. A null position. There is, in principle, in these circumstances, no right answer. There is, in principle, no right answer. And yet you still have to decide. When you're in positions of leadership, you have to decide. Now, some people, when they encounter this, they say, "This is too hard. I'm going to abandon any commitment to ethics, any commitment to leadership. I'm going to take two paths which excuse me from any of this difficult stuff that you're talking about." One group follow the hedonists and they say, "Look, let's all just go and get pissed and hope that someone sorts it out when we sober up." One attractive option. But the other option, and this is a far more seductive one and it gets more adherence, is that some people say, "I will go and join the fundamentalists who will tell me there's no need for me to think about this anymore at all because they know the answers." They can be fundamentalists in politics, in religion, in all sorts of different weird and wonderful ways. And what they all offer you is complete relief from the responsibility of having to decide yourselves. All you have to do is simply obey. Give effect to their world. Surrender that part of you which makes you entirely human, that part of you which is capable of making decisions. So the somewhat more heroic thing that people do is they say, "No, I'll accept the uncertainty. It's okay. I'll understand that there's times when the only option I'll actually have will be to choose the least bad option. There won't be a wonderfully good option, but I'll live with that. And I'll be sincere in the way I do it. I won't try and rationalise my self-interest and try and trick it all up as if it's actually good for them when I know it's really just for me. I'll be honest with myself. And I'll develop a skill set so that when I come to do this, I'm actually doing it with some skill." Ethics is like any other kind of skill. I mean, you don't, if you're in a car and you're getting on an icy road towards a tree, it's not a great time then to say, "Oh, I wonder how you deal with this. Let's throw the foot on the brake." That's the worst thing to do. But if you can spend some time on a skid pad learning how to handle a car, you'll know that you accelerate out of a skid. You do the counterintuitive thing. Practicing developing the skills of good ethical decision making, where you bring your moral courage to bear, that's part of the obligation that you have if you're one of these leaders who's going to exercise strategic vision in the way that I'm talking about it and be able to take these issues on. Now, it's not all hopeless. Don't think that we're always going to be confined to these terrible circumstances where there is no possible response. Sometimes when these values are pulling in opposite directions, there are ways around it. It's to do with the creative dimension of leadership, where you bring a critical and creative mind to bear and you create or discover inflection points, things that change the area. I'll tell you one very brief story, not from sport, but from the construction industry. 25 years ago, I get a call from a bloke who said he'd been in building industry for 30 years. He'd always maintained a reputation for integrity because he always finished his work on time and on budget. But into his marketplace had come some cowboys. They reckon they could do the work in half the time, in half the price. And of course, their clients were saying, "Wow, a quicker, a cheaper option, I'll take that." And did they ever finish their work on time? No. Did they ever finish on budget? No. But that's not doing any good to this guy who is still losing business. So he says to me, "I'm in an impossible situation." He said, "Look, I could maintain my reputation for integrity, but I'm going to go broke. People are going to lose their jobs. Or I can join the rest of the rats in this pack, and yes, I'll live to fight another day, but my reputation, my sense of integrity will be lost." Now, that sounds a lot like the case with Mum with her new dress. One hand integrity, the other sustainability. But in this case, there was one of these inflection points that came out. And you need to think about this in leading, about how you bring this creative mind to bear. The conversation went on like this. Okay, so you've got 30 years of ability in terms of managing the cost and time of your jobs. If you're that good, would you put your money where your mouth is? What do you mean? Well, would you offer a client a bond, 10% of the contract price, which you, the builder, are willing to lose if you overrun on cost and time? What a preposterous suggestion. But yes, I would. Then all that you need to do is to ask your clients to require the same of your competitors, and the table tilts. Now, the unscrupulous competitor can never win, because the more they lie, the more they will lose. That's the key to ethical leadership. Not only do you have to have this disposition, you have to have a willingness to say, I'm not going to accept the world as it is. It's a plastic world. It can be changed. These inflection points can be found. They can be invented. And that's where the hope for leadership lies. When you have the moral courage to act and the creative parts to do this with a sense of a willingness to accept that there may be times when you can't get the right answer. One last thing about it. There's no point fixing one part if you don't fix the whole. We've known now in this country from research done by Hugh Mackay for at least 20 years that you may say as an organisation, this is who we are and what we stand for, and you may treat one group of people, it might be your customers or your playing group or whoever it is, in a manner that's consistent with this. But because of the scepticism and the cynicism I referred to at the very beginning, people won't believe this. They don't even believe their own direct experience. The only way you can convince people of your integrity is if you treat everybody in a similar manner. So if you treat customers in a good way, but people's employees don't treat each other very well, they say, oh, it was fake all along. If they were sincere about their values and principles, they'd treat their own colleagues in this way. But they don't, so they're not true. Or if your suppliers or any other group aren't treated in the same way. If you're in a sporting club and you've got players and they're all treated really well, if they're like little god kings, if it's an elite one, but the officials are treated like rubbish, then that's the test that people will look to. So the challenge for leaders is to be constructively subversive. It's to help organisations to become more like the thing that they say they want to be across the full spectrum of relationships. Particularly in relation to sport, it's to recognise the purpose of safeguarding something which is not just health-making and good for us, but can actually be an example of what's possible because of the truth that it can retain. And most importantly, it's to have the moral courage in the face of all of the things I've talked about to still take that stand, to find that golden mean, and to know that if you do this, even just one person does this, it will make a difference. Thanks.